Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to a new episode of the Jewish People Policy Institute's inside analysis of the state of affairs in Israel and the Jewish world. On today's episode, we're traveling to The Hague, or figuratively traveling. There will be here on Zoom, but we're going to be talking about the recent proceedings that took place there with South Africa bringing charges of genocide using the Genocide Convention against Israel at the ICJ, not the ICC, the ICJ. I make those mistakes also. So if you're one of the people like me who's been making that common mistake, then don't feel so bad. Or I won't feel so bad that I'm not alone, but the International Court of Justice. And we're going to talk to a couple of experts on it. Our interview is with Schondorf, who was the Deputy Attorney General of Israel for almost, I think, 10 years. And was in charge of all international affairs and basically had the job of trying to prevent Israel from what we would call being brought to The Hague. We're then going to talk to our very own retired Colonel Robert Neufeld, who is an international law expert, used to serve in high-ranking positions, also dealing with international law in the Israel Defense Forces, and with Dr. Nurit Cohen, we're going to talk and tap into Nurit. She's not an international law expert. We have to have one who's not, in addition to me, so I'm not left alone. And we're going to talk to Nurit about what does it mean, this whole story for Israel's society? How is Israel looking at it, or the average Israeli? What are they thinking about the charges that have been brought against Israel? And what does it really mean for the average person who's walking down the street? But before we get to Nurit and Robert, here's the interview I conducted just yesterday with Roy Schondorf. Have a look. Roy, it's great to have you with us on the JPPI podcast. Thank you so much for finding the time to join us. There is a lot to talk about, obviously, and here we're focused on the events and the proceedings that took place last week at The Hague. And from your vast experience, particularly in the international department, you were in charge there at the Justice Ministry, basically for fighting these types of things exactly, and combating and trying to prevent Israel from being brought before The Hague. But here it did happen. And I'm curious, on the one hand, to hear from you what your analysis is of how the hearings went. What was your takeaway? What do you think the chances are, and how this is going to play out long term?
So in terms of the hearing, I think there are a few things or a few observations that one needs to make with respect to the proceedings themselves. There is something in the procedure of the International Court of Justice in such cases that creates a degree of an unfairness. The way it works is that a country, in this case South Africa, actually filed its complaint or initiated the proceedings, and as they have done that, they submitted an 84-page document together with hundreds of pages of annexes to the court. At this early stage, it is interesting that Israel did not have an opportunity to respond in writing, right? And the court just decided to hold a hearing with respect to South Africa's request that the court indicate provisional measures. So South Africa then gets a second bite in the apple, right, and gets to argue 3 hours its arguments. And essentially the arguments made by South Africa, by and large, repeated what was included in South Africa's written submission. And Israel only had the opportunity then to argue its position 3 hours of oral argument. Clearly that creates a somewhat unfair situation procedurally, because South Africa actually had an opportunity, a very long time, to prepare a fully developed record of written submissions that were put before the court ahead of the hearing, and Israel actually did not have an opportunity to put in writing any written record. And part of what we have seen in the argument of the Israeli delegation is an attempt in that very limited time that was allocated to Israel to supplement the record by actually making the factual arguments and supporting them by what supposedly is a larger brief that was filed with the judges, but is not really available. So I think this asymmetry between the opportunity that was given to South Africa to present its to develop and present its factual record, and the relatively minimal opportunity that was given to Israel is something that is not insignificant. Within these limitations, I think that the Israeli delegation did a very good job in presenting the complexity of the situation in which Israel is at, and exposing some of the fundamental flaws in the South African argument. Most notably, South Africa portrayed the situation as a situation of one country going into the territory into another territory and just killing large numbers of civilians. And what was very absent from the South African submission was any mention of Hamas, what Hamas has done, its actions, its other than a very brief mention of what happened on October 7 in the very beginning of the submission. There was nothing about the presence of Hamas in Gaza, the way it operates, the way it hides behind the civilian population. And I think the Israeli delegation did a very good job in actually presenting to the court and explaining to the court the actual context and factual situation as it is. Israel is fighting against, not against the Palestinian people, but against a terror organization, the Hamas. It's a very dangerous terrorist organization, as we have seen on October 7. It conducts itself in a way that is not that is inconsistent with the laws of war, hiding behind civilian population, putting its military assets in civilian infrastructure, in schools, in mosques, in hospitals, and by explaining the challenge that Israel is facing, I think Israel did a good job in showing that this is a very difficult and complicated armed conflict and not a situation of genocide as South Africa was trying to present to the court.
But, you know, The Hague has always been for Israelis to an extent this like place that you don't want to go to. You don't want to have to find yourself there. I know you worked for many years in trying to prevent charges from being brought, and there was during your period as the Deputy Attorney General in charge of international law affairs, there was the Palestinians who joined The Hague and the Rome Charter during that period as well. And other investigation that was at ICC, at the International Criminal Court. But how concerned do you think that Israeli officials, soldiers, politicians need to be if, for example, the court decides, the ICJ, that it is approving this temporary provisional measure, whatever it is, whatever it's called, and is going to launch more thorough proceedings about the genocide charge?
Right. So here it's important to draw the distinction between the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, right? The International Criminal Court deals with criminal complaints against individuals concerning international crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And Israel's position with respect to this court is that it does not have jurisdiction over the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Israel never joined the International Criminal Court, and the Palestinian entity, at least on Israel's view, is not a state, could not join the court, could not give the court jurisdiction, and therefore the court doesn't have jurisdiction. The court has taken a different view, but Israel contests that, and therefore it doesn't cooperate with the work of the court. in the International Court of Justice, it's a different mechanism. It's a court that was established to resolve disputes between states. And at least under the Genocide Convention, states that are parties to the Genocide Convention agreed that if there is a dispute between them with respect to the interpretation or the implementation of the convention, that dispute should be resolved by the International Court of Justice. So this is a different situation. Israel has signed a treaty that purports to give jurisdiction to the court. There are issues with the way South Africa brought the case before the court. At least, Israel made the argument that when South Africa approached Israel, Israel actually suggested or proposed to South Africa to have discussions, deliberations, and South Africa just ignored, refused to accept the letter from Israel suggesting that and just went directly to the court. That may impact the jurisdiction of the court, and Israel made the argument. But Israel also argued the case on its merits. Now, in terms of the, what happens if the court actually issues a preliminary order, a preliminary measure against Israel. Here, another point that I think is important to understand is that under the jurisprudence of the court, the threshold for issuing a preliminary measure is very, very low, the evidentiary threshold. It's enough to show that that the claim by South Africa is plausible, right? That there are plausible rights that might have been affected. And this, in the practice of the International Court of Justice, has been implemented as a very, very bare minimum indication of the possibility that genocide might have been committed. So, there is some risk that the court will say when we look at the UN reports that were submitted by South Africa, and we should remember the ICJ is the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. It has never in its jurisprudence doubted a report by the United Nations, even though we know that some of these reports are not always the lighthouse of objectivity, and
to say the least.
So
yes,
there is some risk that so there is some risk that the court will say, that's sufficient to meet that very minimum threshold. It doesn't mean that the court believes that Israel commits genocide. I think the likelihood that South Africa will succeed in this case, even if at the International Court of Justice, is very low. But it's very low also because we know, as a matter of the truth, right, of fact, that Israel is not committing genocide
but it's also
Gaza.
It's a matter
Israel
of perception.
did not go to this war
and how the world looks at things.
Right. So so there is some risk. Now, the court, it's not that if the court issues an order, the next day some bailiffs of the court go to Israel or go to Gaza and begin collecting weapons from Israeli soldiers, right? It's not the court that has enforcement capability. But, if the court issues an interim measure and Israel refuses to comply, and again, Israel may choose to comply with certain, with certain interim orders that are reasonable. But if the court goes as far as to say Israel has to stop, for example, all of its military activity, and Israel decides that it will not comply with, as the Prime Minister has suggested already in some public comments, then there is some risk that the issue will be brought before the Security Council, and the Security Council already has some more some actual powers to impose sanctions or to order Israel to actually take certain action. The United States could veto it, but it's not that simple to veto a decision calling for the implementation of an order by the International Court of Justice. Another aspect is how states might react to this. And, some states might feel that if the International Court of Justice says that there is a risk that Israel is perpetrating genocide, that it may be more complicated for them to, for example, support military action by Israel, sell ammunition and weapons. Maybe some prosecutors might take the cue from the court and say we actually need to open criminal investigations. It might have an impact with the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. So it's not just a declaratory statement that will have no effect in real life. It could really begin a snowball of effects that could become significant. Again, the significance depends also on the political legitimacy of the decision it receives and the way it is perceived, and in the way that states will react to it. But when we think about risks, these are all risks that we need to take into consideration.
And of course, at the end of the day, it's also the perception of how the world looks at it, and how the average citizen in the US and Europe and around the world see that suddenly Israel is being spoken about as committing genocide. That's not a good look. And that doesn't help us. And that ties into what you said, I think, about the diplomatic relations and the impact that would have. I want to ask one last question, Roy, before I let you go. Aaron Barak, the former Supreme Court president here in Israel, really one of the greatest jurists and judges that in Israeli history, is sitting on the court because as a side now to these proceedings, Israel has the right to present one of its own judges or its own representatives to sit on that panel. And I don't want to get into the political question here because Aaron Barak was a lightning rod for some of the Netanyahu supporters. Let's leave that aside for a moment. Maybe if you could just describe for our listeners the significance of having Aaron Barak there, a Holocaust survivor, a Supreme Court president, a distinguished and well-respected judge. Can he really make a difference?
So, I agree with you. Aaron Barak is clearly one of, is perhaps the most famous Israeli jurists worldwide. There is something very showing respect to the International Court of Justice by Israel appointing a former Chief Justice, someone with the standing with the international standing of Aaron Barak to actually sit as an ad hoc judge with the court. And there is also something symbolic in the fact that Israel sends to the court someone that actually survived a real genocide, sending it to adjudicate a case about, where allegations of genocide are made against the Jewish people. Perhaps someone that actually knows how genocide actually looks like, right, can contribute from his personal experience and knowledge to some of the judges that might not, that might be confused to think by arguments of South Africa trying to describe what's happening in the Gaza Strip as genocide. So, in that sense, I think it has a symbolic significance, and it also shows respect to the court. We need to remember Aaron Barak is just one judge out of 17 judges sitting on the court. There is also a judge appointed by South Africa. I think, his commitment is to judge according to international law and to his conscience. Is independent, and I think his contribution will be to bring to the panel, I think, a perspective from Israel about how these how these allegations look like, for someone that comes from Israel with the Israeli experience and the experience of Israeli society. And I think that is important. I think he can also help put in context some of the, for example, statements that South Africa is trying to rely upon, and to actually explain how these things are perceived within Israeli society, what's the significance of some of these individuals that their statements were quoted. So I think he can bring a little bit from his experience and knowledge of Israeli society to the court. But as I said, eventually he's one judge, and judges there come from different backgrounds and may have different views. So it's not necessarily that he will be able to completely change the outcome.
Lots to unpack, and I guess we're all going to have to wait. How quickly, Roei, before I let you go, do we expect a decision? When do we expect the mid-level decision, midway decision?
So in early February, four judges of the International Court of Justice are actually stepping down and are being replaced by 4 other judges. And so I think that in many ways suggests that the decision will be rendered before the end of this month. So I think realistically it's likely to be handed down either next week or maybe even as early as Friday. I think it's more likely that the decision will be published at some point next week. So it's fairly soon.
Well, we will wait with great anticipation and suspense. Roei Schondorf, thank you so much for joining us here at JPPI. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
So that was Roei Schondorf. And I just want to pick up on that point and start with you, Robert. You published a piece in today's Jerusalem Post under the title of the headline, "The Palestinianization of International..." Sorry, I couldn't pronounce it right. Of international law. And basically what your point was, and it's a really good piece, I recommend that people read it, but your point was simple. If you think this is Israel's problem, you just wait, because it's coming for you too, basically. So why don't you explain to our listeners and viewers what exactly the argument you were making?
Well, yeah, so it's kind of very simple to do that after we heard Roei Schondorf. The ICJ is not like an internal issue for Israel, right? It's the international tribunal, and whatever the ICJ will rule will be effective from now on. Okay, so other countries will be also obliged by the same decision or the same norms in a way. So this is the whole story that comes into a climax now with the ICJ. It's a long story happening. We have it happening for decades now. We see slowly more and more norms in international law being Palestinized, basically interpreted, reshaped according to the Palestinian paradigm, with all the bias against Israel put into it. And what I'm arguing in this piece is that basically we are getting a different law. The entire body of law, the entire international law is being now under a process of Palestinization. And this is the ICJ process. That's the last throw. That's the highlight of it. Because when you see countries that know that it's not genocide, there's no real, I didn't see any real serious professor writing this is genocide. Everything is interest here, right? And you see tens of countries joining the South African argument, which is baseless, legally baseless, and of course factually baseless. And we see just, I think the international law is just collapsing because of it. It is becoming too politicized to really help humanity, that much.
Well, I mean,
Because
that's it's a bit depressing. Basically, what you're saying is that international law is not something that we can rely on to protect people because it's just been politicized. It's become a tool. It's what we call here in Israel lawfare to some extent.
exactly.
Yeah.
There is kind of a degree at one point that it's one step too much. And when you make genocide this cheap, okay, to argue, and countries like a herd that's like a pack coming after it, just because they want to argue against Israel because they're Arabs, Muslims, or whatever, because they hate Israel, that makes, I think, that makes already a difference. That's too much. That's really too much. Genocide is something, it's the crime of all crimes. That's something that should be respected. It's like Harry Potter, that's the word that you don't say, that's Voldemort. It's you don't say that word, that chip. You don't use it like that. It's and
the whatever that you referred to before is, Arab, Muslim countries, but it's also anti-Semites. And I think that, sadly, that there's a part of that also plays a role in here. Nurit, I'm curious kind of just your take on when you look into Israeli society and see, this was in the news a lot. The TV stations were playing this and they were airing the proceedings. You could watch them live on all the news websites. And I'm assuming people were logging in and trying to catch what was happening there and listening to some of the arguments that were being made. How do you think the average Israeli looks at this? So we got the legal analysis. Robert was talking to us about the politicization of it all. But what do you think about the average Israeli's perspective on this?
Well, I would say that many Israelis are moving from rage to astonishment to despair when they look at this event. And they are raged because they feel like the reality and the truth is being twisted, being evilly and cynically twisted against their own experience, their own losses, the horrific scenes and things we experienced on October 7th are erased, and instead of it comes this ridiculous and astonishing accusation. And they are amazed because the finger is pointed to the wrong victim here, and they are despair because these proceedings are emphasizing the feeling that we were left alone in this fight. And there are, of course, islands, very important islands that support us, the United States in particular, but we are alone in this fight, and that is really despairing. And I would also say that for some Israelis, the proceedings lifted the curtain and made us see some of the results of our actions in Gaza, because of the Israeli media is reducing the pictures and the reports from Gaza to a minimum as a part of the war effort. Many Israelis were not aware of the actions that were taken in their names in Gaza, and it is a moment of learning for many Israelis. I would also add that the proceedings made many Israelis feel ashamed and embarrassed by some of the statements and declarations made by Israeli Knesset members and ministers that were used against us in The Hague. And many feel like this is an evidence of the rotten political culture that has taken place in Israel in the last years. And the last thing I would like to say is that many Israelis felt pride when they saw the work of the Israeli legal team in The Hague. They saw professional people, brave people, knowledgeable people, people that are part of a jurisdictional system that current government was trying to weaken, and the way that the Israeli team managed to fight back was a source of pride for many Israelis.
So, Robert, I mean, I want to go back for a moment to this whole issue of the politicization of the ICJ, and maybe included in that, obviously, the ICC to a large extent. If it is politics, or if the court has been politicized, is the battle then one of politics? In other words, is the remedy for Israel, and we've seen, for example, Germany's comments and the US comments, we've seen countries that have come out and are being very strident and are saying we're standing with Israel and these charges are baseless, et cetera, kind of tapping into some of the sentiment of what Nurit just expressed of, this is obviously something that's not just legal, as you said before. So what is the way to fight back then? I mean, we brought Aaron Barak there, right, which is our most prestigious, famous jurist, Holocaust survivor. We had a whole team. They brought a British legal consultant who wore one of those wigs, and we had the whole Tal Becker from the Foreign Ministry.
Professors were alive. It's Professor Malcolm Shaw is quite a giant. So
he's quite okay. I'm not saying he's not, but I just enjoyed watching the wig there. But it was. Yeah, it was a serious team. I mean, we take this very seriously. So we're fighting it legally, but is it not also a political battle that needs to be fought?
Yes, of course. There's no question. It's politics and law go together. It always have, and what we are saying, it's international law. It's mainly it's a lot of politics into it. There are two things here. One, we have to stick with our truth. And I agree with Nurit. I know some of the people that some of the delegation from the Israeli delegation, they did a great job, fantastic job. And we have to stick with our truth. And this is what we should be doing and fighting according to the law, the way we know it. And that's always has been our power as Jews, as Israelis. We're always proud of doing things by law in a moral way and not go to the extreme. That's and yes, and we should be fighting the political battle across the world. And for that goes beyond this Hague procedure. Again, decisions have to be made here on the political level as to the future of this area, the after, and all the other issues that are very troubling. And once they are solved, at least there is a way out of here of it, and we need to help. Politics need to help the legal effort, and the legal effort needs to help politics. You can't have just one of them working. You won't win like that.
So on that point, actually, I want to ask both of you the same question then. So let me just, Robert, quickly respond to this also. My feeling has been, and you're starting to hear this a lot in the media now as well, and but talking also to IDF sources, the situation on the ground in Gaza is a bit stuck, although there is still operations, especially in Khan Yunis, but we don't have a government articulating what they want to see happen. And this as a former senior officer, military action is a means for a political resolution. That's the famous Sun Tzu. Clausewitz saying, the Prussian military theorist. We don't have that political resolution articulated by our government. We have reports in NBC. There was one the other day of what the Americans are planning to do and what the Europeans want, et cetera. Doesn't that hinder the political help that we might be able to get at the ICJ? Does that not make it more difficult?
I'm not sure that it's going to affect directly, okay? Because I think that first, countries like Germany are deeply affected by this. It's terrible for them they feel like obliged to us especially on this issue of genocide, and it will not affect directly, okay, but on the long run, on the sides, and that could be some kind of help. The procedure is ongoing, and unfortunately, I guess stopping it will be a very difficult thing to do, unless the court makes the right decision and say it's a non-case, which hopefully it will. It can't do that decision. But you heard Rory, and the chances are kind of slim. We have a Lebanese judge, country we are in war with, sitting on the bench, and a Russian judge, and other. You can see where it goes.
Real lighthouses of justice and human rights.
Yeah, exactly. So what I'm saying, this will go on.
Right.
The political effort can help it on the sides, and push it not directly, and the political effort should be continued or start at least at some point, because it's critical, and everybody feels it. It's all across the world.
So Nurit, I want to get your thought on that too, because I think one of the big criticisms that a lot of people have now also is the lack of kind of what is that horizon that we're working towards, and the government not willing. And we saw the flick-flack or flip-flop, whatever you want to call it, of what happened here yesterday. We're talking Thursday in Israel. What happened here on Wednesday with the whole medicine situation? Is it coming? Who gave the approval for it? And Netanyahu saying it was me, then it wasn't me. I mean, it just seems like the government doesn't want to make up its mind of what it actually wants to see happening, and we as a people should know what's happening.
Of course. I would answer it this way. It is fascinating to see how the two traumas of the past year, the so-called legal reform and the war in Gaza, are combined in this in the procedure in what is happening in The Hague in the last few days. We saw, and of course, Ron Barak embodies so many of the. He was targeted by the side that wanted to change our democracy. And suddenly the prime minister approached to him and asked him to represent Israel in this event, and he agreed, and he's there, and he's putting his gravitas and all his prestige in these proceedings. And it is really fascinating to see how whether or not it doesn't matter what you think about the legal reform, whether you think the legal reform brought the war in Gaza to our homes, or whether you think the protesters brought the war to our homes, you see that in a way those two events are intertwined, and in a way the legal reform is on trial in The Hague, and maybe is buried in The Hague. And it will be interesting to see how that plays along.
This whole thing will be interesting to see how it plays along. But I want to thank Robert, Nurit, and Roe, who joined us earlier. I want to thank all our listeners and viewers. And you can catch us on Mondays and Thursdays here at JPPI, Zoom, YouTube, and of course on where podcasts are played. Have a good weekend and a Shabbat Shalom to all.